I spent almost 3 years convinced that I was the problem, that I was too needy, too emotional, too much, until the day I sat in a courthouse and had to say out loud what had been happening in private. That was the day I finally stopped lying to myself. I used to be really good at being okay. Not actually okay, just performing it. I had this way of walking into a room, any room, and making it look like I had everything together. Shoulders back, smile ready, voice steady. I had practiced it for so long that eventually I couldn't tell the difference between the performance and the real thing. I thought that was strength. I thought that's what strong women did. You push through. You don't fall apart. You handle it. What I didn't understand yet was that I had been performing okayness so convincingly that I had even fooled myself. I know exactly when it cracked open. Not when I left him, not when the lawyer called, not even when I finally told my mom what had been happening. It cracked open on a Tuesday morning in a fluorescent-lit waiting room at the family court building downtown, sitting in a chair that was slightly too hard, holding a paper cup of bad coffee that had gone cold, and realizing I was about to walk into a room and say his name out loud in front of a judge. And I thought, how did I get here? That question had a longer answer than I had room for in that waiting room, but I've had time since then, so I'm going to tell you. His name was Daniel, and I want you to understand something before I tell you anything else about him. He was not obviously bad. He was not the kind of man you look at and think, that's trouble. He was warm and attentive and funny, and he made you feel like you were the most interesting person in whatever room you two happened to be in. That is not a small thing. I want to be honest about that. Because when people hear these stories, they sometimes imagine that we were naive or blind or foolish for loving men like him. And I don't think that's fair. He was genuinely magnetic. He knew how to make a woman feel seen. We met at a work event. Not the same company, just one of those industry mixers where everyone is slightly overdressed and trying to look like they belong. He was talking to a group of people and laughing at something, and I remember thinking his laugh was real, not performed, not the kind of laugh men do when they're trying to impress a room. It just came out of him naturally, and I noticed it. He noticed me noticing. He found me at the bar later, got me a drink I didn't ask for but actually wanted, and said, "You looked like you were calculating an exit strategy over there." And I laughed because he was right. I was, and he had seen it without me saying a word. That was the beginning. The first 3 months were extraordinary. I know everyone says that. I know it sounds like every other story you've heard. But I want you to actually feel what it was like, because that's important. That's the part that makes the rest of it make sense. He texted good morning before I was even out of bed. He remembered things I mentioned once in passing, a restaurant I'd been wanting to try, a book I'd said I was curious about, and he'd just show up with the reservation made or the book sitting on my kitchen counter. He introduced me to his friends early, his family even earlier. His mother told me, the second time I met her, that she hadn't seen him like this in years. I felt chosen, deeply, specifically chosen. Not just liked, not just wanted, but selected. Like he had looked at 100 women and recognized something in me that was different. That feeling is a drug. I need you to understand that it is a drug. Because when it starts to go away, you do not accept that it's gone. You chase it. You do things to try to get it back. You change yourself, quietly, gradually, in ways you don't even fully notice, trying to be the version of yourself that made him look at you that way in the beginning. That's exactly what I did. The first sign I missed was small. We had been together maybe 4 months when I mentioned, casually, that I had been struggling with anxiety for most of my adult life. I told him about the therapy I'd done in my late 20s, the medication I'd tried and stopped, the way certain situations could spiral me if I wasn't careful. I told him because we were getting serious and I wanted him to know me. I wanted to be known. He was so good about it. He reached across the table and took my hand and said, "That makes so much sense. You carry so much, Mia. You take care of everyone." And I felt relief pour through me like warm water because I had been scared to tell him, and he had responded with such gentleness. I did not clock in that moment that I had handed him something. The second sign came a few months later. We were arguing about something small, something I can't even fully remember now, plans that changed last minute, something like that. And in the middle of it, he said, "I just think you're reading this wrong because of your anxiety." I stopped. I stood there in my kitchen and I looked at him and something in my chest tightened. But I didn't say anything. Because the thing was, he wasn't entirely wrong. I did have anxiety. I did sometimes catastrophize. How was I supposed to know, in that moment, that he had filed away what I told him in confidence and was now using it to dismiss what I was feeling? I wasn't ready to know that yet, so I didn't. I said, maybe you're right, and I let it go. That was the first time I silenced my gut for him. It was not the last. We moved in together after about a year. My lease was up, his apartment was bigger, and we were spending every night together anyway. It felt natural. It felt like the next step. What it also was, in hindsight, was the point at which I lost a certain independence that I would not fully realize was gone until I tried to reach for it later. Living together showed me things that dating hadn't. He was particular about the apartment in ways that felt controlling once you were on the inside of them. Certain things had to be arranged a certain way. Certain sounds bothered him. He had very specific opinions about how the evening should go, and those opinions functioned less like preferences and more like requirements. None of it was dramatic. That's the part I need you to hear. There were no explosions, no screaming, no broken things. It was quieter than that. It was the kind of subtle pressure that reshapes you the way water reshapes stone, slowly, consistently, over time, until one day you look at yourself and you've been worn into a completely different shape. I stopped having my friends over because he always seemed vaguely put out by it afterward, never said anything directly, but would be slightly cold for the rest of the evening, slightly distant, and I got so good at reading his moods that I started preemptively clearing the calendar of anything that might trigger that coldness. My friendships started happening in coffee shops on lunch breaks, then in quick phone calls I took in the parking garage at work. Then, less and less. I stopped mentioning certain things at work, too. I worked at a mid-sized marketing agency and I had a colleague named Priya who sat 2 desks away from me. Priya was sharp and funny and paid attention to people. I liked her. We had gotten lunch together regularly in the first year of my job, but after I moved in with Daniel, I started canceling those lunches. I told myself I was just busy. I told myself a lot of things. Priya covered for me a few times when I had to leave early or come in late because of things going on at home. She never asked questions. She just handled it and told me later, quietly, so I could adjust my calendar. I was grateful, and I tried not to think too hard about the fact that I needed covering for. I found out I was pregnant on a Thursday in November. I was sitting on the cold tile floor of our bathroom because for some reason that's where I had ended up, my back against the cabinet under the sink, looking at 2 lines on a test strip. I need to tell you that my first feeling was joy. I know how that sounds now, but it's true. My first feeling in the very first seconds before anything else could crowd in was this rush of pure happiness, because I loved him. Or I loved the person I thought he was, which is the same thing when you can't see the difference yet. I was 32 years old and I had wanted this. I had wanted a family. I let myself feel that joy for maybe 30 seconds before I heard his key in the front door. I told him that night. He went quiet. Not a thoughtful quiet, not a this is big news quiet, a retreating quiet, like something behind his eyes closed a door and I was suddenly on the outside of it. He said, "Are you sure?" I said I was sure. He said, "Okay, let's talk about this when I've had a chance to process." And then he got up and went to make himself a drink and put the television on, and we didn't talk about it again that night. I told myself he just needed time. People need time with big news. He just needed to process. That's normal. That's a totally normal reaction. I was already performing okayness, already explaining him to myself, already doing the work of managing his emotional response while swallowing my own. The days that followed were the loneliest I had experienced inside that relationship. He functioned. He came home, he ate dinner, he slept beside me, but he was somewhere else. Some room inside him that I did not have access to. And when I tried to bring it up, tried to talk about what we were going to do, he would say things like, "I'm still processing, and you're pushing me," and once, quietly, "I don't think you understand how much pressure I'm under right now." I was pregnant, and he made me feel like I was the one causing a burden by asking him to talk about it. I tried to be patient. I gave him space. I handled my own fear alone at night while he slept like nothing was happening. Then slowly something else started. Something I can only describe as a slow withdrawal of warmth. He started finding fault with small things, the way I loaded the dishwasher. The fact that I'd told my mother before I'd talked more with him, that one became a real argument actually. He said I had gone behind his back. I said I had told my own mother about my own pregnancy. He said, "I knew you'd make this about you," and walked out of the room. I stood there in the kitchen and I thought, what is happening? But then I thought, maybe he's scared. Men get scared. He didn't have a good father, I knew that. He had told me about his dad leaving when he was 9, about how it had shaped him, about all his fears around becoming a parent. I had sat with him through those fears and held them carefully and told him he was nothing like his father. I had done all that. I had been so tender with his past. And here he was, using the fears I had sat with him through to justify pulling away from me. I did not see it for what it was at the time. The pregnancy progressed and the distance between us calcified into something structural. He came to the first few appointments and then found reasons not to come. Work things, important calls. Once, memorably, a friend's birthday thing that had apparently come up. I went to my 20-week scan alone. I told Priya about that one. I didn't mean to, actually. She asked how the appointment went and I started to say fine, totally normal, because that's what I always said about everything, and instead I heard myself say, he didn't come. She didn't say anything. She just looked at me for a moment with this very still expression, not judgment, not pity, something more careful than that. She said, "Is this the first one he's missed?" I said no. She said okay, and then she went back to her screen. I thought about that conversation for the rest of the day. I thought about the way she'd said okay, like she was noting something down somewhere. At home, things continued to deteriorate in that creeping, hard-to-name way. Daniel had started doing something in arguments that I can only describe as surgical. He would take something I had told him, something personal and tender, something I had shared in a moment of trust and closeness, and he would use it. Not brutally, precisely, like a key in a lock. After a particularly bad fight about money and the baby and what our plans actually were, he said, "The problem is that you've always had this abandonment thing and you project it onto me. You see distance when I'm just tired." I had told him in the early months about my father, about how he had left when I was 11, about the shape that had left in me. I had cried telling him that story. He had held me. And now he was using it to explain away my very reasonable concerns about the fact that he was disappearing on me while I was pregnant with his child. I remember going into the bathroom that night and sitting on the edge of the tub and thinking, am I doing that? Am I projecting? Is this my damage showing up? Is he right? That question, am I right or is he right, had become the central question of my life. And the exhausting thing about being with someone who is very good at what he did is that you can never quite land on the answer. There's always just enough truth in what he says, just enough of your own actual flaws visible in his accusations, that you can't dismiss it entirely. I was so busy questioning myself that I had almost no energy left to question him. My daughter was born in June. Her name is Lily. She had Daniel's nose and my eyes, and she was the most perfect thing I had ever been near in my entire life. He was there for the birth. I want to be fair. He was there, and in those first hours he held her and something crossed his face that I recognized as real. A crack in whatever had been growing between us. For a few days I thought, this is it. This is the thing that changes everything. Some men need to see the baby. Some men need it to be real. It was real for about 2 weeks. Then the distance came back. Bigger this time, more solidified. He was working later, coming home distracted, physically present but somewhere else entirely. He had no patience for the chaos of a newborn. He would leave the room when she cried at night and I would lie there listening to her, listening to the sounds of the other room and think, I am alone in this. I was not sleeping. I was not eating properly. I had a new baby, and I was recovering physically and emotionally from a pregnancy that had been lonelier than anything I could have prepared for, and I was doing it all while managing the continuous, low-level task of trying not to upset Daniel. I had been so busy managing him that I had forgotten to check in on myself. I went back to work at 3 months. I needed to. Financially, we were stretched, and I also, honestly, needed to go somewhere that wasn't that apartment. That sounds terrible to say about leaving my daughter, but I need to be honest. I needed to breathe somewhere that wasn't suffused with his mood. Priya was the one who noticed first. I was back maybe 3 weeks when she appeared at my desk at the end of the day and said, "Do you want to get coffee?" We hadn't gotten coffee in over a year. I said yes. We sat in the place down the street, and she looked at me across the table for a moment like she was deciding something. Then she said, "Mia, I'm going to say something, and I want you to hear it from a place of caring, okay?" I said okay. She said, "I've covered for you 11 times in the past year. Called you in when you couldn't make it, smoothed things over with the accounts, covered your desk. I haven't said anything because it wasn't my place. But I've been watching you, and the woman who came back from mat leave is not the woman who was here before. And I need to know if you're okay. Not performing okay. Actually okay." I opened my mouth to say I was fine. And then I started crying. Not graceful crying, the ugly kind. The kind that had apparently been sitting behind my sternum for a very long time, waiting for someone to ask the right question. I cried in that coffee shop for a long time, and then I started talking. And once I started, I couldn't stop. I told Priya things I hadn't even said out loud to myself, about the pregnancy and the appointments he missed, about the things he said in arguments, about the way he used my anxiety, my past, my fears, all of it turned into ammunition, about how I couldn't tell anymore whether I was losing my mind or losing myself. Priya listened to all of it without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "That's emotional abuse, Mia, what you're describing. You know that, right?" I didn't answer. She said, "I'm not saying that to be dramatic. I'm saying it because I think you've been explaining it to yourself as something else for a long time." I drove home that night and those words sat with me the whole way. Emotional abuse. I had spent so long in the fog of it that hearing it named, plainly, by someone who had watched from the outside, felt both like a shock and like something I had known forever. I had been explaining it to myself as something else for a long time. Things came to a head 3 weeks after that coffee. Daniel and I had a fight that I don't fully have words for even now. It started over something practical, money, expenses, who was paying for what with Lily, and it escalated in the way our fights always did, which was that I would say something reasonable and he would redirect until we were talking about my failures, my fears, my damage. That night he said, "You've always needed more than a normal person. Even your therapist said that, right? That you had dependency issues." I had told him that once. One time, years ago, I had told him something my therapist had said, in a specific context, meaning something nuanced, and he had stored it. He had kept it, and he was using it now, stripped of all context, as evidence of my deficiency. Something happened in me in that moment. Something shifted, like a plate tectonic shift, slow and enormous and changing the whole landscape. I looked at him and I thought, I am done explaining you to myself. I didn't say anything dramatic. I didn't yell or throw something or give a speech. I just went and got Lily from her crib, and I went into the bedroom, and I sat with her on the bed, and I thought about what I was going to do next. I called my mother the next morning. I told her, all of it. The abbreviated version, the version that didn't include all the small things that were too hard to explain without context, but enough. My mother, to her credit, just said, "Tell me what you need." I needed a lawyer. I needed to know where I stood. I needed to understand what it meant to leave someone when there was a baby involved. What I learned in those next few weeks was not easy. We were not married, which had certain implications. There was the question of custody. There was the question of his rights and my rights and Lily's rights. My lawyer, a no-nonsense woman named Janet who had apparently heard every version of every story possible, walked me through it methodically and at one point said, "You're going to have to document what you've been experiencing, and you're going to have to say it in a room in front of a judge. Can you do that?" I said I could. I wasn't sure I could. Daniel reacted to my leaving the way I think some part of me had known he would. First, he was cold. Then, when he realized I was actually serious, he cycled back into something that looked almost like the person from the beginning. He said things he hadn't said in years. He was gentle. He was sorry. He said he knew he'd been distant, and he knew the pregnancy had been hard on me, and he wanted to do better. I watched myself almost fall for it. That is the terrifying thing I want you to hear. Even knowing what I knew, even having named it, even having sat with Priya in that coffee shop and cried and accepted the word she used, Even then, part of me wanted to believe he was telling the truth. Because I had loved him. I had really loved the person he had been at the beginning. And some deep, wounded part of me was still hoping that person was real and recoverable. He wasn't, I could feel it. The tenderness was a tactic, not a truth. I had gotten good enough by then at reading him to know the difference, even when it cost me something to admit it. I left with Lily and moved in with my mom. I told myself it was temporary. It lasted 7 months. The custody process was awful in the way I think all custody processes are awful, which is to say it required me to lay out the most painful and private details of my life for examination by people I'd never met, while he sat on the other side of a room and watched. His lawyer was good. He presented Daniel as someone who had been locked out of his daughter's life by a controlling and emotionally unstable ex-partner. That phrase, emotionally unstable, landed in the room, and I watched the judge's face for a reaction and felt my stomach drop. But I had Janet, and I had documentation, and I had the truth. When it was my turn, I talked about the pregnancy. I talked about the appointments he missed. I talked about the ways he had used my medical and personal history against me in arguments. I talked about the night he referenced my therapist in a fight. I said, out loud in that fluorescent-lit room, the things that had happened behind closed doors. It was one of the hardest things I have ever done. Not because the words were hard to find, but because saying them meant they were undeniably real. I had spent so long inside the story that I had developed a kind of tolerance for it. Saying it out loud to strangers, watching it land differently in their faces than it had landed in mine, made me understand what I had actually been living inside. The judge was a woman. I don't know if that mattered, but I think it might have. She listened to everything and asked clarifying questions, and her face did not move in the way I feared it would when his lawyer said emotionally unstable. She just kept listening. The outcome was joint legal custody with primary physical custody to me. Structured, supervised visitation to start, with a path to adjustment based on demonstrated consistency. He was furious, I could see it. He kept it together in the room, but I knew that face. I knew the controlled version of his anger, the way he went very still when something hadn't gone the way he wanted. I walked out of that building and stood on the sidewalk in the cold March air and I cried. Not the ugly kind this time, something quieter, something releasing. Priya had taken the day off work to sit in the waiting room with me. She was standing next to me on the sidewalk when I came out. She didn't ask me what happened. She just looked at my face and said, okay. The same way she'd said it in the office when I'd told her about the scan, like she was noting something down. This time I understood what she was noting, that I was going to be okay. The months after were strange. There is a particular kind of grief that comes from leaving a relationship like that, one where you were wronged, and I think people don't talk about it enough. You're not just grieving the person. You're grieving the version of them you believed in. You're grieving the future you thought you were building. You're grieving, in a way, the part of yourself that existed in that story, even the diminished, eroded version, because at least that version knew where she fit. I had to figure out who I was without the constant background noise of managing him. That took longer than I expected. There were days I second-guessed everything. Days I wondered if I had been too hard on him, if I had imagined things, if the story I told in that courtroom had been distorted by my own perspective. That's what years of being told you're overreacting does to you. It makes you distrust your own perception even after you're safe. I went back to therapy. A different therapist than before, someone who specialized in exactly this. She asked me in our second session when I had last checked in with myself, not with Lily, not with the case, not with my mother or my job or Daniel, with myself. I had to think about it for a long time. The answer was years. I had been performing okayness for so long that I had lost track of what I actually felt underneath the performance. Rebuilding that, relearning how to trust my own read on a situation, how to feel something and believe it without immediately interrogating whether it was just my damage showing, that was the real work. Harder in some ways than the legal process. More invisible. More necessary. I started to run again. I had run in my early 20s and stopped somewhere in the relationship, another quiet erasure I hadn't noticed at the time. I started slowly, just 20 minutes in the morning before Lily woke up, my mother listening for her while I was out. There is something about moving your body through air that reminds you that you exist, that you are a physical creature with your own pulse, your own forward momentum. I am not going to tell you I was healed by running. That would be absurd. I am going to tell you that it helped me remember I had a body that was mine. The social fallout was something I had not entirely anticipated, though I suppose I should have. Daniel and I had a shared friend group, the way couples accumulate after a few years together. Mixed couples, people we had met as a unit, people who had histories with both of us. I had been prepared for that group to splinter, for some people to side with him, for some awkward silence on group threads. What I had not prepared for was what happened when people actually heard the full story. A few of them called me after the custody hearing. People who had known us both, who had been to dinners at our apartment, who had watched us together and thought we looked fine. They called because word had gotten around, the way it does, and what they heard had changed something in their understanding of the previous 3 years. One friend, a woman named Sophie who I had met through Daniel, called me and said, "I'm so sorry I didn't ask more questions. I could tell something was wrong, and I kept telling myself it wasn't my place." I told her it wasn't her job to rescue me, that I hadn't known myself how bad it was until I was out of it. She said, "I want you to know that I think what you did took a lot of guts, and I'm on your side." Those words, "I'm on your side," I did not know how much I needed to hear them until I did. Not everyone came around. There were a few people who decided that the most comfortable position was neutrality.